Okay, welcome everyone for our last session in the Jewish literacy class. So a few things as we dive into this. I'm going to talk about sexuality and Jewish attitudes towards sexuality. And then I am going to open the floor for folks to ask their own question. Again, the name of this class is Jewish literacy. It is not, a class in Jewish expertise. Although, as I've pointed out to some of the people who are studying for conversion, you may well know more than 90% of Jews about Judaism, because most Jews never studied Judaism as an adult. And as I hope you appreciate, and certainly tonight's going to be a good example of that, there's a lot of material in Judaism which is really adult level study. And as I often say, most of us will study to the ripe old age of 13 and then go on to do more important things like football and basketball and cheerleading and whatever. Some people call this, in terms of Judaism, but it's also broader than that in religion, pediatric religion or pediatric Judaism. When we only study as a child a subject, there is the inherent understanding that this subject is childish. So I run across many people, including, my own attitudes toward religion before I studied as an adult, with the idea, well, religion is childish. It's something that children need to sort of comfort their lives. But I hope that at least in this, in these sessions, you get a sense that there's a lot there. And it's also, the term literacy is also important to me, because if we go back a few generations, back to the old country, the days of my great-grandparents and generations before them, they were pretty literate and knowledgeable in the world of Judaism. And they may not even be literate. I mean, certainly my maternal grandmother was illiterate. She could not read or write any language. They might be illiterate in what we would call, Western literacy, but be very knowledgeable about Judaism. And then in just a few generations, for most of us, the situation has flipped. We are very knowledgeable and very literate in, in science and math and literature and, whatever subject that you're involved in. But many of us are illiterate in Judaism. So it has been my pleasure to have you join me on this path. And your study is not ended. There's just so much there. But let me dive into sexuality. Again, acknowledging the support of the Jewish Federation of Ventura County. And I think everyone here has been to a number of my classes, so you know that all of these recordings for all the classes and materials are on my website. And then for those of you who want credit for the class, whether just to have what I'm describing as an official looking certificate that I will send you by email, and if you want a hard certificate, I'll print one out and put it in the mail to you, presuming I have your address. I'd like you to take a very simple open book test, and this is the entire test. And some people have written pages and pages and pages, and some people have written 1 or 2 pages. But I'd like you to do that. And then also just let me know when you send that to me, a statement that you've attended the classes. I have not been able to keep track of who's here. When I teach this class in person, I have a sign-in sheet, but hard to do here. Okay, jumping into sexuality. First, broadly stated, Judaism, certainly as compared with other religious traditions, but notably Christianity, is not looked down upon. There are a number of commandments on the subject of sexuality. And the first one is in the first book of Genesis, where God creates humanity, male and female. It's a very interesting subject, that male and female are created simultaneously. And the commandment is pru uvru, be fruitful and multiply. And I should have added the rest of the commandment, and I don't remember the exact translation, but master the earth, subdue the earth. So in Genesis 1, the focus on sexuality is continuation of species, it's reproduction. A very interesting thing is in the very next chapter, Genesis 2, which is the story of the Garden of Eden, we have some really, interesting comments. We have for the first time God saying something is not good. In first chapter of Genesis, God creates all kinds of things on the 6 days of creation. Some things are good, some things are very good, nothing's perfect. But the first thing that's stated as being not good is when God says it's not good for a person to be alone. And we have the creation of Chava, also known as Eve, from some part of Adam's body. And it's not clear which part. We can discuss that if you're curious. I can't remember. I don't think I have information in this presentation on that. But the motivation is never mentioned as reproduction and having children. Motivation is companionship, which is a very interesting take. And it's actually also very, very consistent with the different description of creation in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And the scholars see different authors at work in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And then in the Song of Songs, we have a whole different take on sexuality, which is pure erotic love poetry. There's certainly a lot of mention of companionship and love and lust, but there isn't any mention of marriage. There isn't any mention of having children. So it's actually quite amazing that book is in the Bible. And in fact, I think it's Akiva. Well, the rabbis included the book in saying that it's an allegory of God's love and passion for Israel and Israel's love and passion for God. When Christianity adopts the Hebrew Bible into Christian scripture, the understanding is this is the relationship between Jesus and the church. So it's very interesting that they're all kind of uneasy about the sexuality of Song of Songs, but it's a really interesting book, and I think I'll talk about this at the end of the evening, and certainly when I do anything, I'll send you all notes on this. But I think I might teach a class or just lead a discussion of reading that book carefully. It's not very long, and I have a good translation that is available online. Sexuality in Judaism is absolutely intended to be channeled through marriage. Marriage is the ideal. And in fact, the relationship between God and Israel is symbolized by marriage and a marriage covenant. When the prophets are talking about Israel straying and going after foreign gods, the language of prostitution and adultery is used. And the key point here is the exclusivity of the relationship. So it's an interesting word in Hebrew. I think all of you know this word, kodesh. You hear it in a lot of different words in Hebrew. Kodesh, which means holy, or kadosh is holy. Kiddush, kiddushin, which is one of the words for the first part of the marriage ceremony. Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish. Friday night kiddush. These are all words that revolve around a Hebrew word, kadosh, which at its root refers to an exclusive relationship. So what's exclusive is the relationship between God and the Jewish people. Now it's understood that God has relationships with other peoples, but just as in a marriage, we have an exclusive relationship between partners. So that's at the heart of what it means to be holy. And there's wonderful rabbinic imagery of God marrying the Jewish people with the sky as the chuppah and the Torah as the Ketubah, the marriage document. In fact, I'll just tell a funny little side story. I conducted a wedding in Mexico a few years ago, and 2 Jews, no issue. In Mexico, there are no liberal rabbis. There are no reform or conservative rabbis. And the couple was getting married in Cabo, and they contacted the rabbi. I think they actually visited the rabbi in Cabo, who I'm sure was Orthodox, and the rabbi threw them out without explaining why. And when I finally got in touch with him, normally a marriage on the Sabbath I can understand, an interfaith marriage I can understand. What was the problem? They were going to get married on the holiday of Shavuot, and that was outrageous. But what I thought was, I think, amusing but insulting was the rabbi didn't even explain why. So I explained to the couple why, and then I said, you know what? I think Shavuot is a perfect day to have a wedding, because in the tradition, that's when God and Israel enter into this relationship that I describe at the bottom of the screen there. So I thought Shavuot was a great day to have a wedding. So on the subject of marriage, a key element of marriage is to protect the rights of the woman. Certainly at this, at the time of the Talmud, and by the way, this is another one of these things where marriage is, well, you could argue marriage is mentioned in the Torah, but in the Bible, the language used is when a man takes a woman to be his woman, really. There's not even the word for wife really is isha, which is just woman. So there's no description, there is no liturgy, there's no ritual anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. This all comes out in the Talmud. By the way, there is mention of divorce in the Bible. That's kind of interesting. But it was clear, certainly at that time, that men had all the power, had all the rights. So the institution of marriage certainly is not what we would call egalitarian, but there's a lot of material, both in the Ketubah and in Jewish law, about protecting the rights of the woman, and to kind of equalize the balance, so that she is not literally at the whim of the man. Divorce is mentioned in the Bible, and like everything else in Judaism, the details get worked out in the rabbinic literature. So there are lots of questions and controversy, some of which I will cover, and I go through these slides and I forget exactly what I have in there and not. I know I have some material on homosexuality, on polygamy. So in the Bible, there are a number of cases where Jews in the Bible have more than one wife. I mean, and then there's also concubines, which is another very interesting issue in Jewish law. So Abraham has a child with Hagar, right, and the child is Abraham's, although Hagar is not said to be one of the matriarchs. So she would be I think it's a pilgesh is the Hebrew term, a concubine. But Jacob has two wives, and then the handmaids of his two wives are concubines. But all of the offspring, certainly all of the male offspring, there's one female, 12 male and one female, all of the male offspring of Jacob are considered full children. And two of the women, actually two sisters, interestingly enough, Rebecca, Rachel and Leah are matriarchs. David certainly has many wives. Solomon is said to have thousands of wives. So it is clear in the Bible, men can have more than one wife. It is absolutely clear that women cannot have more than one husband. And probably the issue there is one of lineage and literally, who's your daddy? Because your tribe and your inheritance goes with the father's line biblically. If a woman has more than one husband, before paternity tests and DNA, there would always be a doubt about who's the actual father. But a man having more than one woman doesn't present those problems. Polygamy was outlawed in the Ashkenazi world 1,000 years ago. And in some Sephardic areas, it is still permitted. Sephardic, we discussed this, Sephardic Jews are basically Jews living in Muslim lands. And in Muslim lands where polygamy is permitted in Islam, it is permitted for Jews. And, I say all along, I learned a lot about this from my wife, who grew up in Morocco. And there were Jewish men that had more than one wife that she was aware of. And there's a lot of restrictions. And I don't know how many of these are actually in Islam as well. But the first wife has to give permission for subsequent wives, for the husband to enter into subsequent marriages. And each wife has to have her own household set up for her. And we're going to get into this, I think. There's actually obligations on the husband to be sexually available to his wife. And that gets complicated if you have more than one wife. Maybe that's why there's a limit on 4. But actually, the limit of 4 wives comes out of Islam. And when Christianity, of course, outlawed the idea of polygamy, so that's really the reason why it was outlawed in the Ashkenazi world. In Israel, polygamy was outlawed, but if you came to Israel with multiple wives, you did not have to divorce them. Adultery is another very interesting subject in terms of its legal technicality. Biblically and in Jewish law, adultery is a married woman having sex with a man not her husband. A married man having sex with a woman not his wife, but not married to someone else, is not technically adultery. I would say in the Reform world, it would be considered technically adultery. But that's a whole interesting legal issue. And another important legal issue is the issue of mamzerut. Those of you who grew up in Yiddish-speaking homes know the phrase mamzer, and it's not a nice thing to say about someone. And it's usually translated into the English word bastard or illegitimate. But in sort of Christian jurisprudence and probably Western jurisprudence, although I really don't know, a child of unmarried parents would be considered a bastard or an illegitimate child. That is not what a mamzer is. A mamzer is the child of 2 parents who are prevented from having sex with one another. And the classic example would be the child of adultery, but also incest and some other technical issues could produce a mamzer. And it's a terrible problem in the Orthodox world. I don't believe this is an issue in the conservative world, but in the Orthodox world, a mamzer cannot marry another Jew. A mamzer can only marry another mamzer. And you've got to be creative to solve that problem. If people are interested in how legally that problem gets solved, I'll be happy to talk about that in the class that I conduct. And it's really a Temple of Dad Elohim class, so I don't advertise it widely. We've been having some discussions on what Judaism has to say about premarital sex. So it is not forbidden in the sense that adultery is forbidden. But as you can imagine, in the traditional Jewish world, a man and woman are not even allowed to shake hands. Some of you may be familiar with this. If you meet an Orthodox Jew of opposite gender, you don't shake hands with that person. So if you can't shake hands, it's pretty much going to restrict other sexual activity. So premarital sex is certainly greatly frowned upon. I always, when I'm working with couples on their weddings, I always mention that at least one of my law professors, Jewish law professors, said that Judaism recognizes a common law marriage. So if you have 2 Jews living together, and I mean by living together openly in front of the community, not sneaking off to Motel 6, under certain Jewish legal theories, they would be considered married. And if they were to split up before they actually got married, they would actually need a religious divorce, a get. So it gets very interesting and complicated in legal details. Yeah, okay, so I discussed this, the idea that sex is natural and desirable. So the idea being the concept that the flesh and the spirit are sort of at war with each other is a very Greek philosophical concept, and one that's heavily picked up in the Christian world. In Judaism, the body and the spirit, you could say the body and the soul, are intimately related. You could say even are like lovers. And that's one of the justifications of the idea of physical resurrection, that in a final judgment, God is not going to just judge our body. God is not just going to judge our soul, but God combines our bodies and our soul for a final judgment. And I talked about this, the idea of it. The first thing that God says is not good is being alone. So God makes for the man an ezer kenegdo. So, and my translation is helper in opposition. You will often see that translated as helpmate or helpmeet or something like that, which can sound vaguely demeaning, but the Hebrew word ezer means help. And in other places, in the Psalms, for example, God is described as an ezer. So that can't be demeaning. But the most interesting part of this is the word keneged, kenegdo. That comes from the concept of like the scales of justice in opposition, but in a creative, I would say a creative tension and balance. And I always think about this as being a pretty good model for marriage, that you don't want members of a zug, of a couple, of a partnership, to be mirror images of, well, maybe mirror images can be ambiguous, to be kind of the same thing. I think it's healthy for the two members in a partnership to have very different skills, very different insights, and the partners help each other by being in a creative balance. And there's actually even more detailed Hebrew grammatical analysis that can make the word ezer, instead of being a simple helper, to mean a power in opposition. So that gets very interesting. I mentioned that the woman is made from Adam's tsela, and that's often translated as rib, but in other places of the Bible, the word tsela is used as side. So one of the ideas is, the problem in the text is in Genesis 1, God creates Adam, male and female, he creates them, is the way the text reads. And then all of a sudden in the Garden of Eden, we just have Adam and there's no woman. So the question is, what's up with that? And one answer is that the first Adam was created as a hermaphrodite, both male and female. And in one discussion of it, it's almost like Siamese twins. So the surgery isn't to remove a rib, but the surgery is to split the male and female halves. And there's other midrash to explain that language. And the shame about being naked comes with eating the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, as I discussed in a class, and I'm pretty sure it's on my website, called Revisiting the Garden of Eden with a Jewish Tour Guide. This phrase, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, eitz da'at tov v'ra. The phrase tov v'ra is a merism. It means everything. It's a knowledge of everything. But shame about nakedness comes, I would say here, with being human and being adult. In that discussion I give about the Garden of Eden, I say, what things are not ashamed of being naked? And those are animals and babies. But as adults, we have a sense of modesty about nakedness. And the term in the Bible, as you probably know, for sexuality, one of the terms for sexuality is knowing, which implies an intimacy between partners. I mentioned polygamy and concubinage and children of concubine being full children. And one goal of sex is pleasure and intimacy. So if marriage were exclusively, and sexuality were exclusively for the purpose of producing children, then you would not have marriage between people who are incapable of producing children, whether they were infertile for some biological reason or just past the age of childbearing. But certainly that is not the case. And as I talk about, and I even sing about, I have a song about this, that men have sexual obligations to their wives. A man may not swear, take an oath by that's what I mean by swear. A man may not take an oath not to have sex with his wife. If he takes such an oath, he can be forced to divorce his wife. And then the frequency of sexuality is a function of his job. So in the Talmud, and this is codified into Jewish law, that a sailor who takes long trips is obligated to have sex twice a year, a camel driver once a month, ass driver once a week, a man of leisure, a scholar every night. And this is only at the woman's willingness. And there's a wonderful story, I'll just mention it, of in the Talmud, because of, like members of Congress, the rabbis exempted themselves from many regulations. And in fact, there's a lot of imagery about studying Torah as almost a sexual attraction, a sexual relationship between scholars and Torah. Torah is a feminine noun, and the imagery can get very interesting. So it tells a story about a scholar in the Talmud who would leave his wife for a year and only come back one night a year. When did this guy come back? On Erev Yom Kippur, when you're not allowed to have sex. But still, she loved him, and she would stand on the front porch as the sun was setting on Yom Kippur, waiting for this guy to come home. And one year he got so caught up in his studies, and of course he's living some distance from his home, that he doesn't leave in time. And she realizes as the sun is setting, he is not going to make it home because he can't travel on Yom Kippur. And a tear slips from her eye. And as the tear slips from her eye, the study hall collapses and kills this guy. Good story, and talks about actually the power of tears in Judaism. There's a midrash that as Israel suffers, there's a great vat somewhere, and the vat is filling with the tears of Am Yisrael, the people Israel's suffering. And when the vat is filled, the Messiah will come. Just a nice imagery. I don't think it means very much. So I mentioned marriage is designed to protect the rights of the woman. Again, I am doing a lot of weddings these days. I had triple my usual number of weddings last year, and I've already booked almost double my usual number of weddings. I have 2 weddings this Saturday. And I always go over the idea of a ketubah. Some of you who are married have a ketubah, and a traditional ketubah is not the slightest bit lovey-dovey. Most of us have ketubahs, and I would say me included, which talk about how the couple loves and respects each other and promises to build a wonderful home together, and so on and so on and so on. Beautiful, but that's not what a traditional ketubah says. Traditional ketubah is written in Aramaic. It's not written in Hebrew, and it specifies a legal arrangement. It specifies how much money the bride and groom are bringing into the relationship. It specifies the bride price that the groom is paying for the bride, which, by the way, is 200 zuzim for a virgin. It specifies whether the bride is a virgin or not. It's 100 zuzim for a bride who, nobody does the inspection, but for a bride who is divorced or widowed. And just so you know, a zuz is a Babylonian form of currency, and most of us are familiar with it from the song Chad Gadya, where my father buys a baby goat for 2 zuzim. So the bride is worth 100 goats. And I once had a bride bring a little stuffed goat under the chuppah to give to her husband, which was very cute. And that it also specifies the amount of money that the groom agrees to pay. First of all, it specifies that he is going to support her and children and educate the children. And there are cases with which I am aware where people have actually gone to their ketubahs and had them translated and used them in divorce settlements, because the groom undertakes these obligations. It specifies an amount of money that he will pay to his bride should they divorce, and it gives him a security lien in his assets, so that should she have to collect in front of a Jewish court, it should be very easy for her to collect it. I've had a few weddings where couples have had traditional ketubahs in the Aramaic. I've never seen it translated into the English on the beautiful thing that you hang on the wall, because everybody would be horrified. And what I will see from time to time is traditional Aramaic and then a lovey-dovey English. but more common is lovey-dovey Hebrew rather than Aramaic, and lovey-dovey English. The ways you create a marriage is contractual, namely a ketubah. By the way, the word ketubah comes from the word katav, which just simply means it's something that is written. The writings in the Bible are called the ketuvim. The exchange of a gift. So in a traditional marriage, I think we talked about this. In a traditional marriage, the groom gives the bride a gift, which is a simple ring. It's supposed to be simple, so she knows how much she's getting for the privilege of being acquired by the guy, or cohabitation. And in a modern ceremony, we do all three. So I've had cases where 50 years after their marriage, it was in one of these classes, somebody came to me and said, you know, after our wedding ceremony, the rabbi took me and my wife and put us in a room. There was a few, snacks to nosh on, and we stayed there for a little while. And then he came and took us out, and none of us had any idea what was going on. And what was going on was a ceremony called yichud, which comes from the same root as the word echad, meaning one. Yichud means togetherness. And if you were a traditional Jewish couple, you would never be alone with each other without benefit of a chaperone. So this is the first time the couple is alone. God knows what happens during that time. And so all three are included. I'm going to have some fun with the couple's permission. My understanding is the bride for my wedding this weekend is about 6 weeks away from her due date. And it's pretty clear to everyone that that is the case. So I can very sagely and soberly say this couple has satisfied the requirements of yichud for purposes of the wedding. Looking forward to that. And then a modern wedding combines two ceremonies: kiddushin, which is betrothal or engagement, and in the kiddushin ceremony, the couple binds themselves to each other, but because they're not yet married, they still don't have the right of intimacy with each other, but they also are not allowed to have intimacy with anyone else. It would be adultery if they did. And this gives the bride a time, and traditionally was about a year, to get the household in order. So what's his name wouldn't run off. He would actually need a get to dissolve the relationship. And as I always joke during wedding ceremonies, that this created a certain amount of tension. So over the centuries, that period of time now lasts about 5 or 10 minutes. The opening of the ceremony is kiddushin, 1 cup of wine, and then the wedding ceremony is called nisuin, which literally means elevation. You're elevating your status, another cup of wine. On the subject of divorce, a man in the Bible, in the Torah, I'm pretty sure it's in Torah, it talks about the husband granting a divorce to the wife. So it's something only the husband can enact. And that creates a big problem, because if he doesn't agree to do it, there is no divorce. And under strict Jewish law, he can remarry, but his wife can't remarry. She is considered to be, the term is agunah, which in Hebrew means a chained woman. She's chained to him. And that creates a huge problem. And courts can order guys to be beaten to grant a divorce. I once saw an announcement of a death penalty in the Jerusalem Post. And this was in New York, but it was reported in the Jerusalem Post that a Beit Din has sentenced the guy to death because of this problem. Now, they couldn't actually execute him, but I think the legal logic was, I never really pursued it, that, well, since we sentenced him to death, he's as good as dead, therefore his wife is released. She's technically a widow. But it's a huge problem in the Orthodox world, because it gives the groom a tremendous bargaining power in terms of, in divorce settlements, civil settlements, child support, and so on. And the conservative movement, which sees itself as being able to change the terms of the get is hardwired into Orthodoxy, includes something called a Lieberman clause in the Ketubah. So in the Ketubah, the parties agree that should they get a civil divorce, the groom hereby grants the wife a religious divorce. In the Reform movement, there is no get. The Reform movement considers a civil divorce to also be a religious divorce. And in Orthodoxy, I think a large number of Orthodox rabbis will not conduct a wedding unless the parties outside of the Ketubah enter into an agreement which is consistent with the ideas of a Lieberman clause. So I talked about modesty and premarital sex, that there are many laws of modesty. The couple is never alone until married. Men and women don't touch. Therefore, premarital sex is out of the question. And one of the interesting questions is in the literature is, as times change and as we now live in a world where people are not getting married at 16 or 17 or 18, but are getting married well into their 20s and 30s, are we really expecting people to be celibate? And also people are widowed and living longer, and are we expecting people not to have sexual contact, after a death or a divorce? So again, this is something that in particular the conservative movement struggles with, and the issue actually of mikvah becomes I wouldn't say a problem. Yeah, I'll say a problem, because typically women only go to the mikvah, which is a ritual immersion, after their period and after 7 clean days, which, by the way, they haven't touched each other even casually for half a month. So now, people that live in this world describe it as like a monthly honeymoon as they're reunited. And oh, by the way, she is also at her moment of maximum fertility. So there's method to this madness. But if you're going to a mikvah, it means that you're now ready for sex and sexuality. And one of the things preventing, certainly in the Orthodox world, of women not having sexual contact is if you have an unmarried woman going to a mikvah, that would be a statement to the community that she is sexually active. And that can be a subject of embarrassment and shame. And I mentioned the definition of mamzer.
Unless it's prior to her marriage, as she's preparing for her marriage.
Oh, yes, it's absolutely necessary. So one of the things you have to do in the Orthodox world, and I would say in the conservative world too, if you follow those laws, the laws of Nidah, that you have to time your marriage to a time when you're going to be clean from a menstrual point of view, and then you go to the mikvah before your marriage, and that's absolutely necessary. And in fact, in the Sephardic world, there is a kosher mikvah in Southern California, and actually, while candidates for conversion, when you convert, you also go to the mikvah, men and women. So while they're taking their shower and getting clean and getting ready, there's a lot of time for me and other rabbis to chat with the mikvah staff. And I remember them describing Sephardic immersions for Sephardic brides. The Sephardim, really, they know how to throw a party. So for the mikvah, the young woman, the bride, and all of her female family go to the mikvah, and it's a huge party. So that sounds like fun. Never been invited to one of those. Yeah. So I think I'm done with this one. So on the subject of homosexuality, just take a drink. There are 2 places in the Bible where it says, where the commandment is, do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence. And the Hebrew is toeva. So that opens up a number of questions. First, what is the meaning of toeva? I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And second, what does it mean for a male to lie with another male as one lies with a woman? This has come to be understood as anal sex, but it's certainly not clear in the text. And then the question arises: is it okay for? It really arises in the conservative movement. is male homosexuality okay as long as that particular sex act or other forms of male sexuality kosher? And it's pretty clear that neither the Bible or the rabbis considered lesbian sex as sex at all. As far as the rabbis and traditional understandings of sex was, sex involved penetration. So if you have two women, you don't see legislation on lesbianism prominent in Jewish tradition. So that's the first question. What does it mean for a male to lie with one as one lies with a woman? And then so that's a big issue for the conservative movement. And actually, this coming Monday, we're going to have a discussion of that with my little Temple of Dad Elohim group, and an article by Elliot Dorff, the leading conservative legal mind. But for me and for Reform Judaism, there's another question, and that is, what is toeva? What's the meaning of toeva? And with one exception, and hundreds of I don't know about hundreds, and many examples, toeva refers to ritual prohibitions. So here are some of the things that are called toeva in the Torah. You shall not eat any abominable thing. Namely, you don't eat anything that's not kosher. There's a prohibition against marrying your own ex-wife if she has had sexual contact with another man. And so in the most kosher way, you get divorced, she marries someone else, and either she becomes a widow or she gets divorced. You are not allowed to marry her. That's considered toeva. There are prohibitions against women wearing men's clothing, such as pants. That's called toeva. And then there's a bunch of other examples of the practices of other nations, and here they're typically talking about ritual practices, are called toeva. This is all out of Deuteronomy. Consulting with spirits is called toeva. Worshiping other gods is called toeva. Even if you read the story of Joseph, of Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat fame, one of the things that amazes Joseph's brothers before they know that Joseph, the prime minister of Egypt, is really their own brother, is the fact that he's willing to eat with them, because Egyptians considered eating with non-Egyptians toeva, in the words of the Bible. And sacrifices and offerings without ethical behavior in Isaiah are toeva. So in Reform Judaism, which is not going to be aggressive about, let's just talk about eating non-kosher food as toeva, I think there's good logic about not being aggressive about homosexuality as toeva. It is a ritual violation, not an ethical violation. So having said that, I would say, most of my colleagues that will conduct same gender marriages would certainly insist that marriage really reflect monogamy, that the idea of an open marriage, which is an ethical issue, is not what we're talking about. So many Reform rabbis are homosexual, and many Reform rabbis will perform same gender marriages, including me. In fact, I am not aware. There may be Reform rabbis who will not perform same gender marriages, but I am not aware of any of them. There are Reform rabbis who will not conduct interfaith marriages. There are Reform rabbis who will not conduct marriages on the Sabbath at all, but I'm not aware of any Reform rabbis who would restrict same gender marriages. So it's really a hallmark of Reform Judaism, I would say, to treat men and women equally, and to be tolerant of gay and lesbian and LGBTQ and so on. So bottom lines on sexuality: adultery is traditionally only a married woman having sex with a man, not her husband. Reform recognizing equality would certainly not take that narrow definition. And in a CCR committee report on adultery, there's a very interesting discussion of different forms of adultery, and I would say different levels of adultery. So at worst is what the paper calls classic or consenting adultery. So you have a couple that are having sex out of wedlock, and they are both aware of it, and they're doing it, simply to gratify their sexual urges. At a level below that is unknowing adultery, which is the result of deceit. So you can imagine here, just to be maybe stereotypical, a guy is on a business trip and he meets a woman and lies to her about whether he is married. Certainly the reverse can be true as well. So the person who is lying clearly is committing classic adultery, but the person who is unaware that the other party is married technically is committing adultery, but doesn't know it. And then they also recognize what they call technical or circumstantial adultery, which the case that they point to is a partner having a lifelong illness. So you can imagine a person who is suffering from a debilitating illness in a nursing home, and the other party is having a relationship, and even a sexual relationship. Technically, that would be adultery, but the Reform movement, I would say, is understanding of that. And then there's a very interesting perspective by Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who is certainly an innovative Jewish renewal rabbi, and he argues that the original mitzvah about sexuality was related to population. Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. So Rabbi Waskow would argue that we have fulfilled that mitzvah. We have, as a world, been fruitful and multiplied, and many would argue that that we have more than subdued the earth. So Rabbi Waskow says, so what is our now biblical imperative and inspiration for sexuality? And he points to the Song of Songs, which doesn't talk about marriage and children, but certainly talks about a committed, loving relationship. Let's see. I'm just going to look. I'm looking at the notes. And Ryan raised the question: was there an Orthodox rabbi who went to jail? Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I'm not familiar with that. Went to jail for threatening and times beating thugs to force them to get a get. Under Jewish law, a person can be beaten by order of the Beit Din. I don't know whether that is allowed. I suspect it's not allowed under Western civil law. Oh, I do have some interesting texts. I forgot I included this. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. So let's see, where is this? This is Kabbalistic text, so this is not Zohar. Sexual union is holy and pure when performed in the right way at the right time and with the right intention. Let no one think that there is anything shameful or ugly in such union, God forbid. The right kind of union is called knowing, and it isn't called that for nothing. Unless it were very holy, it would not be called knowing. Now, Maimonides actually goes in the opposite direction. So this guy is criticizing Maimonides. Maimonides, roughly the same time frame, maybe a little earlier than this writer. The matter is not as Rabbi Moses Maimonides of blessed memory imagined and thought in his Guide to the Perplexed, where he praises Aristotle for stating that the sense of touch is shameful. God forbid. The matter is not as the Greek said, what he said smacks of subtle heresy, as if that Greek scoundrel, I think he's talking about Aristotle here, believed that the world were created with divine intention, he would not have said what he said. But we who possess the Holy Torah believe that God created everything as divine wisdom decreed. God created nothing shameful or ugly. If sexual union is shameful, then the genitals are too. Yet God created them. How could God create something blemished, disgraceful, or deficient? After all, the Torah said, this is the sixth day, God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. And this is I think this is probably Zohar, but I'm not 100% sure. Oh, I think this is just continuing the same text. And I'll just read what I've highlighted here. When a man unites with his wife in holiness, the divine presence is with them. You should welcome her with words that draw her heart, calm her mind, and bring her joy. then her mind will be linked with yours and your intention with hers. Speak with her words that arouse desire, love, and passionate union, and words that draw her into the awe of God. I'm going to teach a class on this at some point. I'm working on it. There are two traditions in Judaism. They both understand sex as holy, but in one tradition, the idea is to make it even more holy. If you're a true tzaddik, if you're a true holy person, you can and should divorce your lust and your lustful passions from the act of intercourse and creating children. I would say that's a minority opinion, but it's in the Talmud, and Maimonides picks up on that opinion. I'm not sure what else I have on here. But there are other things brought up in the particularly in the Zohar, which are very sexual and talk about there is nothing. Basically, there are traditions that say there is nothing forbidden between a man and a woman, so long as each party consents to it and doesn't consider it shameful. So let me read what I have here. I once heard a chaste man bemoaning the fact that sexual union is inherently pleasurable. So that's this idea. He preferred that there be no physical pleasure at all, so he could unite with his wife solely to fulfill the command of his creator, be fruitful and multiply. What he said helped me understand a saying of our rabbis, may their memory be for a blessing. One should hallow oneself during sexual union. I took this to mean that one should sanctify one's thought by eliminating any intention of feeling physical pleasure. One should bemoan the fact that pleasurable sensation is inherent to the act. If only this were not so. Sometime later, God favored me with a gift of grace, granting me understanding of the essence of sexual holiness. The holiness derives precisely from feeling the pleasure. The secret is wondrous, deep, and awesome. There's a lot of material on this, which I am digesting. So here are my bottom lines on Judaism and the class, at which point I will open the floor to questions, and I already had one submitted in writing. The overriding goal of Judaism is to make the world a better place by joining together and organizing. I often talk about this. The word religion comes from the same root as the word for ligament. It's people being joined together. I will often hear people criticizing the idea of organized religion. And I absolutely praise religion as being organized, because if you're trying to make the world a better place, why not organize? And I always, think of this image of you're having a blood drive or somebody needs blood. Well, you could stand on the corner with a big sign saying, my Uncle Fred needs a transfusion. Or churches and synagogues and other organizations can have blood drives. And some of those blood drives, dare I say in this country, all of those blood drives will have a big cross involved with them. In Hebrew, it's Magen David Adom, a red Jewish star, not a cross. In Muslim countries, it's the Red Crescent, not Red Cross. But absolutely, we should organize to make the world a better place. Judaism seeks to bring the God of Abraham into the world. It does not seek to make everyone Jewish, but absolutely, and I've discussed this, the idea is we are here to teach the world about the God of Abraham and how the God of Abraham wants us as Jews to act and wants everyone else to act. So one of the issues that I struggle with as a rabbi and a Jew is with organizations that are opposed to public displays of religiosity, such as a display of the Ten Commandments, such as a display of, the birth of Jesus. I forgot what you call it, a manger, and I struggle with it because our job is actually to bring God into the world. I would say the issue is coercion, and even subtle coercion. If everybody is praying in a class, a child, particularly if they're praying out loud, a child might feel compelled to say the same words. So when I say I struggle with it, I don't mean I have the answer. I really struggle with that. And I once had somebody for Citizens United for separation of church and state take me out to breakfast and want me to get involved in that. And I said, I appreciate the point, but I'm just not passionate about it. Of all the things that I worry about, that's not one that I am passionate about. I do think governments should be secular, but I really want people to be religious. So I struggle with that. Another thing that is important is at the heart of Judaism is covenant. I remember when I took this class, probably 40 years ago or so, I knew a lot of random Jewish stuff. People have described the phenomenon as adult onset Judaism. Well, from my childhood, I knew a lot of random Jewish stuff. I was bar mitzvah. I knew what a tallis was. I knew what Torah was. I knew what Haftorah was. I knew a lot of random Jewish stuff, but I had no idea of what was going on, which I'm trying to summarize on this page. And what's the point of covenant? Covenant is an astounding idea. Covenant suggests that not only do we have obligations to God, but God has obligations to us. And this is a dance and a partnership. That is very different from the religions that preceded Judaism, where the gods were basically in charge and they could do whatever they wanted, and the gods were not bound by ethical constraints. And of course, as I say over and over again, Judaism's focus is on what we do more than what we believe. And actually, I just did had a video interview from a Catholic scholar, which is going to be published shortly, and I will send it out to you. And one of the questions he asked me in closing is, do I have a problem with religious, in his case, and religious Christians? And the answer is absolutely not, because I, as a Jew, care what people do, not what they believe. So if I don't care what fellow Jews believe, as long as they work to make the world a better place, how much less should I care what non-Jews believe? So when I think of people building hospitals and caring for the poor, and these are devout Christians, in my language, they are doing mitzvot, and I have nothing but admiration and praise. So now your questions, and I'll end the slideshow and stop sharing. And I'm just going to begin with one that's already been sent in by Lois, and I would call on Lois to mention her question, but I know she's having trouble with her voice. So I'm trying to see if she's here. So she said, address the question of buying plots ahead of time. What tips would you give that would be great, even local sites you prefer, how to get started, what to do in some kind of order to get this done? Okay, so I remember someone asking me, I don't think it was Lois, I think it was somebody else, asking me whether doing what cemeteries and mortuaries call pre-need, which is exactly what Lois is asking about, is in some sense counter to Judaism, and it's absolutely not. And it's a reasonable thought, because the idea of having a baby shower, a party about the new baby before the baby is born, is very foreign to Judaism, because the idea is you're giving the baby a kanahara, which is you're bringing the evil eye, you're inviting the evil eye to witness that this wonderful thing is about to happen, and you don't want the evil eye to be aware of the fact that you're joyfully looking forward to the baby. So should we not be planning a funeral in advance for the sort of the same superstitious reason? And I would say I've never heard anyone object to that. And so in direct answer to Lois, if you call any mortuary, they will be delighted to work with you on pre-need. And I did this for myself, in terms of my own family. You sit down and then you get to decide what kind of casket you want, where your plot is. And I would say also, when families immigrated, particularly the Ashkenazi world from Eastern Europe immigrated, the very first thing they did in arrival was to buy a cemetery plot. So the only way I know what town my family is from in Belarus is the name of my cemetery plot near Fort Lee, New Jersey, is called the Hummler Young Men's Society. So in Yiddish, the town Hummel, which is in Russian, the town Gummel, that's how I know what town we're from. But that was the first thing that they did. They created a Chevra Kadisha to help people with funerals. So, there are, and I know we're coming from a lot of different areas, but certainly in Southern California, there are cemeteries and mortuaries which are exclusively Jewish. And so Mount Sinai, as you might guess, is a Jewish cemetery, and they have their own mortuary. Cemetery is the land, mortuary is the folks that handle the body. There's Eden, there's Hillside, there's a lot of Jewish entities. Then there are many cemeteries in Southern California which have Jewish sections. I was at one today conducting a funeral. And then either they themselves are trained to treat the body in accordance with Jewish tradition. And then I know in Southern California, there is a Orthodox mortuary called Chevra Kadisha, where if people want to have their loved one's body treated according with strict Jewish law, they will invite that mortuary, and then they can be buried anywhere. So I hope that answers the question. Lois, I know your voice isn't great, but did that answer your question?
Thank you.
You're welcome. And David and Evelyn have their hand up.
Well, it's on the same subject.
Mhm.
By doing your funeral planning pre-need,
Mhm.
is also an act of love for your family.
Yes.
My daughter pointed out to us, she knew that she was our heir and that there is life insurance well and above the amount needed to pay for a funeral, but that check doesn't come from the insurance company the day after you die. And she said that she did not have the funds
Mhm.
to front the cost of a funeral.
Yep,
So
yeah. And it's
Evelyn
not
and it's not cheap.
It's not cheap, particularly in Jewish tradition. And I think we talked about this when we talked about life cycle. Jewish tradition discourages cremation vehemently. I would say in the Reform world that vehement discouragement is not the case. But to get not so much the casket, but the plot can be very expensive. And, and the other elements are not inexpensive either. And there have been several times, because I make it known to the Jewish cemeteries and mortuaries, that if they have someone who is really at need, that I will contribute my services, without charging. And some of the Jewish cemeteries will also contribute plots. And then, Chabad, which is ultra-Orthodox, will also help out because they know it's expensive and they don't want to see people opt for cremation, which
Yes.
is much less expensive. But another element, David, of what you're saying, and which I absolutely agree with, is the idea that all the decisions are made when someone has just lost a parent or someone close, a spouse. There's a lot of decisions to be made, and it's not the best time to be making those decisions. So it is very loving when you do pre-need to make all those decisions.
Yeah.
And I will get calls routinely from people who I'm happy to say are still alive. They will call me and asking, "Are you still doing this rabbi thing?" And I say yes. And they said, "Oh," I say, "Why?" And they say, "We're going to be meeting to arrange pre-need, and we want to give them your name and phone number."
Yeah. So anyhow, we bought a double deep plot and paid that off in time.
Mhm.
And then we made the mortuary arrangements,
Mhm.
paid that off in time. And as I recall, the plot actually cost less than the mortuary arrangements.
Oh, that's surprising to me, but
Yeah,
yeah,
but, well,
yeah.
some years have lapsed between the time we started
Yes,
the
yes,
plot and the
yes.
time we,
And there is an
Modular
aftermarket in grave sites because people move out of the area. So if you have a Jewish newspaper, you will see advertised, for sale plots in Jewish
Al-
sections of cemeteries.
also in the LA Times obituary section, you'll see.
Oh,
them.
yeah, I never noticed that. That's a
Yeah.
good point.
Anyway, I just thought you'd be interested.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, any other questions at large? Via.
So about the Kabbalah text you showed,
Uh-huh.
that was written from the male perspective.
Yes.
Would you say the author would also intend the same for women?
I actually don't understand the question.
Well, like,
What do you mean by intend the same?
well, like, would he be okay if women also did the same, like also viewed sexual holiness in the same way? Because I feel like there's like in some ways the idea of sexuality is very progressive when it comes to women, but then at the same time there's some rules like that also seems, like it also shames them at the same time, but they're also saying that it shouldn't be shameful. So I feel like there's lots of
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure. So first, let me say, from a traditional Jewish perspective, if they're talking about sexuality, they're talking about men and women. So to have a sensual relationship requires both from a traditional point of view. I would say this is, I would certainly not argue that, against gay and lesbian relationships. But clearly, the Kabbalistic point of view, which embraces sensuality, embraces it for both men and women. And there's a lot of very specific discussion of it is the obligation of the man to lovingly arouse his wife and be responsive to her sexuality. And it's a way of equaling, to some degree, equaling the tables, because in most other aspects of relationship, traditionally men have the upper hand. So there's a phrase in Deuteronomy. It's actually one of these phrases in the Torah, which in its context focuses on one thing, and then the rabbis take it to focus on many other things. So it says, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it says, when a man takes a second wife, he is obligated to provide her with ona'ah, with basar, and I can't remember the Hebrew word, but ona'ah means his obligations, and it's understood to be his sexual obligations to her rather than her sexual obligations to him. And there's a tremendous amount of discussion on that. One of the interesting things is basar. The word literally means flesh, and it probably in its original context meant food, that he was obligated with providing her, enough food to eat. But some of the rabbis, particularly in this Kabbalistic tradition, take the word flesh literally, and say that that he is obligated to provide her with flesh to flesh contact, and they actually use it to prohibit making love while wearing clothing. That the flesh to flesh contact is absolutely necessary. Other Jewish traditions will go in the absolute opposite direction, although I'm not aware of this, of this concept of the hole in the sheet having validity, but it is very interesting in an attempt to kind of equalize the tables. There are, maybe you're thinking of things like women are not allowed to show their hair and must wear modest clothing where men are not. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah, so that's a recognition, maybe an over recognition of the reality that men are, I would say, visually attracted to women, and that in some cases they are aroused and cannot resist. And actually, I have a paper I read which is really interesting, that some of that legal material actually comes from the Song of Songs, where the lover is praising the woman's long flowing hair, and it's in connection with being arousing. So if that's in the Bible and you're a woman and you're a married woman, you shouldn't be displaying that which is arousing to anyone other than your husband. I think people would realize that, you know, men should have control over themselves, and I absolutely agree with that. But so that's the origin of those rules. And similar rules in Islam. It's interesting to me, I think I've commented on this, it's always interesting to me that Christian fundamentalism, I think with some exceptions, didn't go down that direction. I think there is certainly a dressing modesty sense among fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Jews, fundamentalist Muslims. But in Judaism and Islam, in traditional settings, men and women don't sit together to pray. But in Christianity, I think there may be some examples of men and women sitting together to being prevented from praying together, but not many. I don't know if that answers your question, Via.
No, it did. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, anything else?
Yes, I have a. yes.
Okay, I don't know who's saying that. Is that Barbara?
Barbara, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So what are you going to do for next week?
Next week, I am not planning on having anything Wednesday night. I'm going to take some time off. I'm exhausted, I have to tell you. Sorry. But this week, I taught a class. Well, I involved in Torah study Saturday. I taught a class Monday night. I taught a class Wednesday night. I have some meetings Thursday night. I had 2 funerals this week, and I have 2 weddings this week. So I'm just exhausted. I'm going to take a few weeks off. I'm going to plan other classes. I'm going to start, I think in a week or 2, a detailed study of the Song of Songs in connection with my Monday night class. And I'm going to invite you all to that if you would like to study it, and I'll record it and maybe send it out. It's a really interesting book of the Bible. And if you haven't studied it, and it makes a difference what translation you study. Some of the translations are hysterically funny in their avoidance of the sensuality of the text. So,
what about sex in the Book of Ruth?
Yeah, so there are some
There's a lot of sex
euphemisms.
there.
Oh, there's sex in the Bible, and I have a class on my website called Illicit Sex in the Bible and the Genealogy of the Messiah. So how's that for an interesting combination? Because there are some really interesting questions, interesting sexual couplings in the Bible, and they all seem to be in the line of King Solomon. And even more fascinating, the opening chapter of the New Testament, which is the book of Matthew, and Matthew's genealogy of Jesus doesn't mention any women except for these strange sexual couplings. So it's fascinating. But yeah, the book of Ruth is sexually suggestive. I mean, it talks about Ruth lying down in the middle of the night after the boys have been threshing and celebrating the harvest, and she uncovers his feet. And, you know, again, if you're reading in English translation, you might wonder what's going on with that, unless you have a good commentary where uncovering someone's feet is a symbol for exposing genitalia, is a metaphor. Or so there's a lot of sexuality below the surface in the book of Ruth. Sandy, you have a question.
Well, hopefully my audio works okay now.
We hear you fine, yes.
Okay, good. Beyond this class, beyond the exam and the certification, it's been difficult to find a new community to affiliate with. But not being part of your conversion class, but being interested in confirmation or conversion, what follow-on studies would you expect as a rabbi to whom I may be going, as prerequisites to conversion, and in particular, what degree of facility with Hebrew beyond recognizing and being able to sound out words and phrases, what degree of facility with Hebrew would you expect?
Yeah, so let me answer the questions in order. So I often say you can be a Jew by choice, but you can't be a Jew by self. So what I would say is that an important part of Judaism is developing a relationship with a rabbi and a congregation. And I have a number of people taking this class who are interested in conversion. Some of those people I'm actually working as their sponsoring rabbi because they're local, or in some cases they have no other rabbi because there's no one in the area. I'm thinking now of Amarillo, Texas. But where there's, where there are possibilities of congregations, and I spoke to someone today from Santa Barbara, and I strongly encourage the person to get in touch with the congregation in Santa Barbara, because it's very important to be affiliated with a local congregation. And and you and I can discuss this privately in addition. I'm not aware of any rabbis that insist on any Hebrew literacy at all in connection with conversion. And many people whose conversion, I supervise, they might want to learn Hebrew, they might want to learn, the 22 letters and the vowels. I think it's a good thing to do. And I've created actually some tools to help people do that. But it's not a prerequisite for conversion in my world. I don't know about other rabbis. And the issue then is, I would say, for adults who want to become bar and bat mitzvah, I would say some Hebrew literacy is necessary, because the idea is you're going to read from Torah, you're going to lead services. So I would say that's where Hebrew literacy comes in.
Okay, good. And we can cover other things offline. It's just in the course of the pandemic, certainly in the Pasadena and broader LA area, the only people meeting in person regularly are Chabad, and they're just not the right people for me.
Yeah,
So,
and my sense is I need to
but
check
that's
this with-
changing.
That's changing. That
the more of the temples are beginning to look at
Yes.
meeting in person, but they're concerned about liability and risks and taking care of their population. And at this point, the most liberal of the of the congregation seems to be inviting their own formal members first, and then on a space available opportunity, they may invite others to attend.
Yeah, and that happened actually when synagogues first opened up. They expected a huge rush, and I think the first weekend or two they got a huge rush, and then
Yeah.
people discovered, gee, it's not so bad to sit at home and attend services. So I led services on December 24th and December 31st in a pretty big room at Temple Adat Elohim. On December 24th, there were about 7 or 8 people. And on December 31st, there were 4 people. So I think hopefully things are opening up and we won't, fall back in terms of COVID, and it will become more feasible to connect with a local congregation. I remember I had a discussion with a local Chabad rabbi about conversion, because someone approached me as a local rabbi saying, I want to convert, but I want to convert Orthodox. So I said, oh, you want to talk to Chabad. And this Chabad rabbi told me that they don't conduct Beit Dins. They don't do conversions. And I think I even understand the theology behind that, but I'm not sure it's true of all Chabad. And before I say that, I should say that, but I actually had, a young woman, I don't know how old she was, a woman called me about conversion, and she wants to convert in a traditional Orthodox way. And I told her I asked her if she called her local rabbi, and she said, yeah, I've called a few times, but he hasn't called me back. And in furthering the discussion, it turned out that it was a Chabad rabbi that she called, And maybe his not calling her back with the 3 times you're supposed to discourage. So I said, try again, but also try and find a modern Orthodox synagogue. And it turns out this is Santa Barbara. There is one, but they don't have a rabbi.
Well, in the
Right.
Pasadena area, certainly there's a huge difference between Pasadena Chabad and Santa Anita Chabad. I mean, it's almost like there is a liberal version of Chabad 10 miles away from the Pasadena Chabad, but we'll talk more offline.
Yeah, okay. And let's see. Yeah, Rachel and Drew. It's true of all Chabad. It was part of a deal struck with the wider Orthodox. Whoops. Hang on. Let me find the rest of the chat. Regarding the whole Schneerson Messiah thing. I've never heard that. But you might be right. There's also an issue in Chabad teaching that non-Jews have a different level of soul than Jews. And I don't know if that becomes an issue with conversion, but they do recognize Orthodox conversions. I'm pretty sure. So I don't know what the story is with Chabad, and until I do, I really shouldn't comment. Any other questions or comments? Well, hearing none, I'm going to stop. Well, first, I'm going to thank everyone for doing this.
Thank you.
18 sessions.
Thank you, Rabbi Mike.
Not
It's
small.
always interesting.
And I'm going to
Thank you,
stop
Rabbi.
the recording.